With me today, what an honor, is Assembly Republican leader James Gallagher. He has represented California's 3rd Assembly District since 2014. You don't look old enough to have done that, James, but congratulations on your youthful vigor. Before joining the Assembly, James served on the Sutter County Board of Supervisors for 6 years, earned your Bachelor of Arts degree at Berkeley. Want to hear all about that. And then got a law degree at Davis, where you graduated at the top of your class. You advocate for small businesses and farmers in your law practice, and you're a partner in your family's farming operation as well. Also, I think this is absolutely adorable. You married your high school sweetheart, and you have 5 young children.
Indeed.
Do we call you leader? Is that what we say when we are using an honorific, or may I call you James? Is that okay?
James is fine. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So, James, you're, I would be remiss if on Radio Free California, I didn't ask you about your favorite piece of California history. You represent, in part, Sutter County, or I guess it's all of Sutter County. Is that right?
Yes, I do.
So can you tell me a little bit of history, either John Sutter related or adjacent? Any kind of history.
There is a very rich history in Sutter County, named after John Sutter, of course. But one of the things that I point out is the home of the very first levee district that was ever formed in the early 1900s. People got tired of having devastating floods wipe out their farmland and their homes, and actually formed the very first levee district #1 in Sutter County to raise the revenue to build a levee to hold back the floodwaters along the Feather River. And that started kind of a whole, clamor for building more levees throughout the system that now today, still protects us from devastating flood in California.
Wow, that's a great story. Thank God for that investment and the wisdom of the people of Sutter County. That's awesome. So you and I are here primarily to discuss this outlier of a bill that apparently is, as you and I talk, this is on Wednesday of last week by the time people hear this. But it's on Governor Newsom's desk. I am shocked that a bill drafted by Republicans has ended up on the governor's desk. That means it went through the Assembly and the Senate. That's Assembly Bill 297. I'm flipping through my notes here. It is called the Wildfire Prevention and Forest Resiliency Act of 2021. I want to know 2 things right off the top. What would the bill do, and how in the hell did you persuade Democrats to go along with a Republican-authored bill?
Well, this is something we've been working on, and it's a continuation, of that effort to ensure that we get on top of the real cause of devastating wildfires in California, which is fuels. In many of our forested lands and wildlands, we have overgrown vegetation. We have brush that is, feet high in certain locations. And wherever that spark may come from, if it comes from a power line, if it comes from a tire blowout, as happened in the Calfire in Redding, wherever that spark come from, it falls on this tinderbox that we have allowed to accumulate in our forested and wildlands. It goes back to when we really limited and restricted logging severely, when we stopped really managing, our lands. And that's continued for decades. We've had decades of that kind of policy, radical environmental policy, that has really been the cause of these wildfires. When a spark falls on that tinderbox, it becomes an out of control fire that firefighters literally cannot stop. So what we've been advocating for is let's get back to actually managing, our forested lands in California, and working with the federal government on the federal land as well. And I would say about 5 years ago, we really shamed the Democrats. Myself, Senator Dolly, Assemblymember Dolly, Assemblymember Vince Fong, Assemblymember Jim Patterson. Many of us really pushed for this, that we need to get funding back into doing the kinds of thinning and forestry management practices to reduce this fuel load. And about 5 years ago, we shamed them into putting the first real funding, significant funding into this effort. And so that's continued in successive budget years. But AB 297 allows this Calfire grant program that was created to advance payments to nonprofits, fire safe councils that are doing a lot of this work, RCDs, resource conservation districts, and the private sector. It allows it basically to contract with private sector loggers who know how to do this work to go in there and actually reduce the fuels, to do fire breaks, to do thinning, to do prescribed fire, where that makes sense. And it's been a great program. And so 297, I can't imagine why anybody would oppose it.
I'm sure they did, though, right? I mean, you must have had some opponents.
What you have is you tend to have sort of special interest groups that say, "Oh, we don't need to do that work." Sierra Club and others that will come in and try and prevent these things from moving forward. But we've been really strong advocates, and we've gotten people on the Democratic side, frankly, to come along with us and say, yes, this is what we need to do. And so 297 passed and is on the governor's desk. We hope that he will sign it. That will allow us to continue to advance those grant programs and do more of this work. I was actually just on a site this last week where they were doing this in Glenn County. They were set to do 300 acres of treatment. But with this grant and with the contractor they were working with, they came in under budget and were able to actually double that work and do over 600 acres of treatment. So that's great. And these are the kinds of programs we need to keep doing. We need to keep putting funding into, and 297 will help accomplish that.
Well, despite the governor's claims, there are a lot of demands on the budget. He knows that when he knows it, and he doesn't when he celebrates "quote unquote" surpluses. Where'd you find the cash for this initiative? And is there a lot of money involved, or is it relatively like letting the free market do its business out in the rural parts of the state?
Well, some of the money comes from the Cap and Trade Fund, which we were not big fans of, but we were saying, hey, if you're going to have this Cap and Trade Fund, that's supposed to reduce carbon emissions. All the studies have actually shown, the Legislative Analyst's Office has actually shown that the best bang for your buck is fuel reduction in your forests. And the reason why is because our, dead and dying trees, overgrown forests actually are a carbon emitter, because, that's just giving off carbon. A healthy forest is a carbon sink. And so doing this work actually gets you more bang for your buck and reducing carbon emissions. And we said, this should be funding that kind of work. And so it really started with that, like I said, 5 years ago in the budget process, we were able to secure that funding, and it has been able to continue. There's also been general fund money that's gone into these efforts as well, because we think that's just part of the basic, infrastructure, if you will, of the state, that you need to be doing these kind of maintenance projects. And so that's where a lot of the funding has come from. This bill actually just allows us to do the advance payments, to basically get the money out faster to these groups that are doing the work. And so 297 helps accomplish that.
A lot of the work that you guys have outlined in the bill, that, as I say, is now on the governor's desk, shows that the real challenge here, or a real challenge here, is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which environmentalists have successfully used to shut down forest management since my childhood, and I'm probably as old as your father. It's been a long time. And how would this bill handle complaints filed under CEQA?
So this bill doesn't directly address CEQA, and that is still one of the big missing pieces here. We've done some work on this front. There's been some streamlining. There's a program, I think it's called CalVTP, that helps streamline some of the CEQA process to do these kinds of fuel reduction projects. But I've had bills. I think I've done it twice now, and other Republicans have tried to do a bill that just has a straight CEQA exemption for these kind of projects. When we're talking about trying to protect communities like Paradise, that my community went through the most devastating wildfire in California history. When we're talking about protecting those communities, we shouldn't allow CEQA to be a block to protecting those communities, to doing the work in and around those communities to make them safer. And unfortunately, the bills that have tried to make an exemption from CEQA for these projects have died in the Natural Resources Committee. I even had, 1 year, the chairwoman, Luz Ribas, tell me she didn't have time to hear the bill. It was extremely insulting to me and my constituents. It was during COVID, and they said, oh, well, we only have the hearing rooms for so long, and we have so many bills. And it was outrageous, and I called it out at that time that, to say that you don't have time to hear this bill. And the real reason is, the special interests that control those committees, and the staff, that are very, radical, don't want to hear these bills. They don't want to push them through because they think that CEQA is like holy writ and that you should never reform it. And it's been very difficult to do any kind of CEQA reform on a whole host of fronts because of that. Like I said, there has been some, streamlining that's kind of helped move projects forward. But what we really need is a more blanket exemption for thinning projects in and around endangered communities.
One of the questions I asked you earlier, I just want to sort of elaborate on that if I can and see if you have some thoughts about it, is we've had a fairly mild wildfire season this year by recent standards.
Thank God.
Yeah. And I wonder if that has allowed the Democrats to feel less politically vulnerable on this, because otherwise, I mean, virtually every summer, it seems like a third of the state burns down. And where is Gavin Newsom? He's trailing a gaggle of television news crews, stomping through what used to be somebody's living room or main street in a fire zone and saying, look what capitalism does. He refers to utilities as dog eat dog capitalism. These are the most highly regulated, maybe outside of medicine, these are the most highly regulated businesses in the state, maybe even including medicine. And yet, it's capitalism, it's climate change, it's big oil, it's fossil fuels. Your bill returns us to a status quo ante, a time when people really understood you have to pay taxes to build a levee. And also those forests do not manage themselves as utopian lefties might wish. Do you suppose that the mild climate the mild fire season really has helped you depoliticize? Does that play a role? If it does, if it doesn't, I'd sure love to know, how did you get this through? Because I can imagine Democrats up there, my sense as an outsider, as an amateur watcher, is the Democrats aren't eager to hand you guys any victory at all.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me tell a quick story. We had a devastating fire in 2019 that burned the town of Berry Creek and came all the way down to Lake Oroville. It was yet again another devastating fire, and Gavin Newsom used that as an opportunity to show up in Oroville, in my district. Didn't tell me about it, didn't tell any elected leaders about it, but use it as a backdrop to talk about that it's you driving your car and your truck that has caused this, and it's really climate change, and this is why we need you to drive electric vehicles, and then announce an executive order, which now we're seeing the results of. Where he said we are going to go by 2035, no sales of any gas-powered vehicles, where he mandated that off-road equipment and trucks, would also go to electric, zero emission, and said that's really the problem. He used this tragedy to, fulfill his agenda, right? To push his agenda. And one, it's just false, because the real reason that we're having these fires is because of the buildup of fuel and the brush piles, 10 feet high in parts of the U.S. forest land that have been the cause of these fires. And he says nothing about that, doesn't talk about that at all. It's a completely false narrative. And the reality is those are the things we need to do. And the other reason that the Democrats don't want to talk about this is because they're the reason that is the case. Decades of Democratic policies that they've pushed, have led to this result, to this tinderbox that we have on our wildlands in our forests. And they don't want to talk about their record because it's not a good one, and it has led to this problem. So look, I don't think they can go away from it. I don't think they can walk away from it, but people need to be reminded of the truth of how we got to this point. It was great because that night, after he announced it, I actually got to go on Tucker Carlson, and I got a national spotlight to talk exactly about this and to tell everybody the real truth about why we're having these wildfires. And the answer is not to force. I mean, let's just take that for example. Let's just take that logic for a second. According to all of all of these folks, that even if we, reduce the emissions to the level that they want and we put everybody in electric vehicles, you're not like changing the climate back for decades, right? So in the meantime, we still have this devastating fuel load in our forests, and everything you're doing is actually adding great cost to people, huge inconvenience, taking people who need those cars desperately to get to work and telling them you should pay twice as much for an electric vehicle, all to do what? To continue the status quo of wildfires that are happening every year. Why not do the one thing that we know would actually prevent those wildfires, which is get into our forests and do the thinning, do the management, do the prescribed burns that would actually do something about that fundamental cause of these fires. And that's what's most frustrating, but I did get a chance there to rebut him on a national stage. And that was a great opportunity. We've continued to do that, in the legislature and as we've had these debates on the assembly floor.
You neatly, I think, in this bill, avoid trying to, I don't know how else to put this, but you sort of stipulate, the climate is warmer and drier. You're acknowledging the concern of the liberal left and of all. I think we should all recognize, the planet is warmer and drier right now, or at least California is. But their sense seems to have been, absent this bill, all the kinds of climate change initiatives you've talked about that Newsom is engaged in. Is that a tactical kind of decision on your part to say, yes, we are aware things are drier and warmer, but that doesn't disarm us completely. We still have a responsibility to manage the forests.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've said is that, okay, climate change is an exacerbator of the problem, right? We have longer and drier periods, right now in California than what we've seen. But the fundamental problem is still fuel. Again, like if you have this sort of ladder of fuels, it starts with brush, lots of vegetation, dead and dying trees. When that spark falls on that, it becomes this huge conflagration that burns up the whole forest. Whereas actually, historically, when we had managed forests, you'd have a fire, but it would just burn on the forest floor, and it would burn up the small amount of brush and vegetation that was on the forest floor, but it wouldn't get up into the top of the trees and have this huge forest fire that the firefighters right now today are telling us we can't even stop it. All we can do is like try to contain it. We can't stop it, right? And it's because of that fuel problem. And so what I say is, look, that's the fundamental issue. Whether you want to talk about climate change, whatever issue you want to talk about, that's the fundamental issue when it comes to wildfire and how we actually prevent it. And by the way, the science tells us it's actually good climate policy, because healthy forests, again, are a carbon sink and actually help us reduce emissions, per dollar, actually more efficiently than some of the other things we've done, like solar panels, the truck and bus regulations that have been passed. It's actually more efficient use of our dollars to actually get into our forests and make them healthy.
Well, I won't make you travel with me down all the rabbit trails I love to go on here, to talk about the fact that clean energy, quote unquote, is not clean, that those are, Chinese people working under dangerous circumstances to mine rare earth minerals, or children in Central Africa digging with their bare hands to find cobalt for our batteries so we can have electric cars.
All of which is true.
Yeah. There is no, everything's a trade-off. I think Thomas Sowell is not unique in telling us that, but he sure does preach it, and I love it. Everything's a trade-off. There is no clean energy. There is no, everything we do as humans has a kind of, if you like, a kind of Greek tragedy quality to it. That is to say, our ancient Native American forebears, when they killed a buffalo, knew that what they were doing was harmful to that buffalo. It hurt them. They got it, and they, prayed. We ourselves eat and live and drink on the land, and that has an impact. And the question is, what's the best impact? Hey, what are the chances Newsom vetoing or signing? What do you think?
I believe he will sign this bill. I don't think he has any other choice, really. I think he would look very bad. And, you always know you're in a good position with Gavin Newsom. if you choose between making him look good or making him look bad. He cares very much about, especially now on the national stage. I think that it would, not help his ambitions to be against preventing wildfires, which is exactly what this bill does. So I imagine that he will sign it. And even though he doesn't talk about it a whole lot, he knows that this is a fundamental problem that we face when it comes to wildfire.
Well, speaking of that national stage, just two more Newsom-specific questions, then we'll wrap up with a couple of the highlights from the recent legislative season. What do you think? I am well known, at least on this with this audience, for just refusing to accept that Gavin Newsom ought to be meeting with Chinese officials to discuss climate change. I have my own logic for that, but he's apparently announced that he's going to China this month, in October, that is, to go meet with what are typically called in China subnational or regional governments. I don't know if he doesn't know how the Chinese government is arranged, but local governments do not have any kind of autonomy. They operate, in fact, much as I think Gavin Newsom would love for our local governments to operate, which is basically pass-through organizations for the governor. But in China, he's dealing with people who don't have the autonomy that local governments do traditionally in America, certainly in California. Do you guys have any authority over his travel schedule when he decides he's going to go trot off and go meet with the Chinese to discuss climate change?
No, I don't think we have too much authority over his travel budget. Certainly, actually, I mean, we do control the state's budget, so presumably the legislature could reduce the amount that's available for that, in the executive, but I wouldn't expect that out of this supermajority Democratic legislature who refuses to stand up to him on pretty much anything.
Yeah.
So I think it would be difficult, to actually pull back on that. But with all that being said, your point is a good one, and it's like, all of this is really for show. Most of the things that Gavin does are for show. He did what? Last 2 weeks ago, he said, hey, I'm going to double the amount of people down to the border, right, to deal with the crisis at the border. That was 20 people, right? He sent 20 people, down to the border. Obviously did nothing to stop the fentanyl that's coming across our border, did nothing to actually stop the human trafficking that is continuing to go across our border. But it gave him something to announce, right? And this is another one of those things. I'm going to China, I'm going to talk to them about what we need to do on climate change. I will say one thing. I wish that he would actually talk about this more in the sense that it's China who's, the leading emitter of carbon, right, in the world. Yes. India and many of these other countries, and we've been doing all this stuff in California that's very expensive, that's made it the most unaffordable state in the nation, right? 700,000 people have left because they can't afford to live here, and it's because of these policies, right? Why don't you expect this out of other countries? We're talking about less than 1% of the world's carbon emissions here in California that we've been dealing with, that we've been taking all the burden of, and not expecting more, out of other countries like China, right? So on that respect, I almost feel like, well, why don't we take a pause here, because we've done a whole lot at great cost and great expense to our people, and expect more out of other countries to meet climate reduction goals, carbon reduction goals.
You'll pardon me for sounding like one of those people who shows up at a local chamber mixer and collars you in the corner and will not let you out. But it does seem to me that the Chinese have a huge incentive to cripple our economy by requiring us to become utterly dependent on the kinds of products they produce. They don't produce oil. They don't produce gas, natural gas. What they produce is rare earth minerals and cheap solar panels.
A lot of solar panels.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A lot of solar panels. They're trying to get into the electric car business. They would love to see us. Yeah. They would love to see us become utterly dependent on the things that they export and specialize in. And we have Gavin Newsom almost as their head sales guy.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're doing is actually just making us less competitive, right? Reducing jobs and opportunities for us, meanwhile empowering these kind of countries. This is the same thing actually on the oil and gas front. Like, who are you really empowering with the policies that you passed in California? Petro dictatorships, place like Ecuador, right? Venezuela, they benefit because you're still importing all the oil and gas you need. You're just doing it, instead of doing it from, much cleaner and sustainable practices here in California, our domestic, oil producers. We're just empowering the petro dictatorships who continue to import that oil, by the way, into our ports, and bring us because the bottom line is you still need oil and gas, to run this state and to have cars to drive, kids to soccer practice. You still need all those things. Gavin knows this, and what he's really, his policies actually empower these places with terrible human rights offenses, like China, right? Places with terrible environmental records. They're burning down the rainforests, in Ecuador and other places, and all of that is actually only being increased by the policies that we've created here in California. It's ironic. And it really needs to be talked about a lot more, that this is not actually helping the situation. It's making it worse.
Last Newsom question, one that I'm sure you're confronted with almost every day. Is Gavin Newsom going to run for president? Do you see a way through for him to run in 2024?
That window is shrinking, right? Every day. I think that Gavin is setting himself up to either run this time or run next time, right? And everything is kind of developed for that. I think that, despite how many times he says, I am not running this year, I think everybody, even the 60 Minutes reporter, this last week, just doesn't believe him, right? Because everything that he's doing, with his campaign across all these states, trying to put himself in the limelight, going to New York for the climate summit, it's all designed to set himself up to run for the presidency. And you know what? I actually kind of hope he does. Because I think when he does, his record will actually be exposed, because he's had it real easy with the media here in California. He won't have it easy. And it started with that 60 Minutes interview. He will not have it easy on the national stage. And every other state is looking at California and saying, that's what I don't want to be when I grow up. A place that has the highest homelessness rate, a place that has the highest poverty rate, a place where, our roads are crumbling and our infrastructure is falling apart. Where we're going to go fully electric, yet our grid is actually falling apart and sparking wildfires. Look, nothing that Gavin has said he was going to do has actually been accomplished in California. In fact, it has gotten worse. And that whole record is going to get exposed if he puts himself out there on the national spotlight and runs for president. Look, if he wants to go and do that, go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, the near-term consequences seem to be favorable to our side. And by that, I mean, I look at some of the most excessive bills that have moved through the legislature this year. I'm thinking of the one that would have enhanced penalties for sex trafficking of children. And it took Newsom's intervention to get the Democrats, to come back to their senses on that. I think it was Shannon Grove's bill, Shannon Grove out of Bakersfield. Do you have, looking over the legislative season and accepting AB 297, your bill on wildfire management, is there another bill that is on the governor's desk that you think is actually has surprisingly survived the legislative gauntlet, and you think Newsom will approve it and that you really like? Is there anything else you can think of? One bill.
Let me just start with SB 14, because I think the real truth there is Gavin was embarrassed.
This is the sex trafficking of minors.
Yeah, the sex trafficking bill. So look, Gavin only did that, again, because of his national ambitions. This got huge exposure that the Democrats that he supported, that he stood next to, their criminal justice agenda, he has stood by his entire career. Reggie Jones Sawyer and the members of the Public Safety Committee. This bill, which again would make trafficking of a minor child a serious felony, should be a no-brainer, was killed in that committee. It was killed by Democrats, by the Democrats that he supports, the criminal justice agenda that he supports, of reducing penalties for crime, of not allowing new penalties for crime. So these people that he's been part of, this whole agenda that he's been a part of, is what killed that bill. And it got national exposure. Again, finally, like the light was shined on this gaping wound, right? And Gavin, the emperor has no clothes, and he was so embarrassed that he immediately went out. Oh no, we're going to do something about this. I don't support this. We're going to do something about this. And then he intervened. He only intervened, because it was an embarrassment for him. Right. It's not because he doesn't support this woke criminal justice agenda, that is really the impetus behind all of this. So I just want to point that out just for everybody. Glad he did, but and ultimately the bill passed. But again, he's been part of that, and it was a wild legislative session. There's a bill on his desk right now to try and create a single payer system. That would cost. I think last effort was like $400 billion to actually implement. Which
is more than the annual budget at present.
That would rob Medicare. That would take people off of healthcare plans that they actually like. And that bill passed out of the Senate, and the Assembly is on his desk. I hope he does not sign that. He has on there the ability to strike. That if you go on strike, you'll get unemployment benefits. Right? This is crazy. That would incentivize strikes and actually takes away from the whole idea behind strikes, which is that both parties sacrifice in an effort to reach a compromise on pay and benefits, right? And our unemployment insurance fund, is in a deficit, and so you would actually be adding to that deficit. And so for those people out there who actually do get hurt on a job and have to, or find themselves unemployed involuntarily, right, are going to have less of that benefit if this bill actually passes. And again, they did that all right to appease, the strike that was going on, with the screenwriters, right? And so we've got to stop this kind of emotional policy making that makes actually no financial sense. That's actually going to lead to less protections for workers, and get back to a place where we pass reasonable policy in this state. I keep saying, let's just get back to a reasonable middle, right? If we could just get back to a reasonable middle in this state and tackle the real issues that are facing us. We know we have a homelessness crisis. We know we have a fentanyl crisis. We know that California has become unaffordable for most Californians. The biggest thing on everyone's mind in California right now is, how do I pay the bills? For the average Californian, they're going, how do I pay for groceries? How do I make sure I got, that money to help pay for my kids, team uniform, right? How do I get to work, and pay the kind of gas prices that I'm having to pay right now? And Gavin Newsom and the Democrats have done nothing to lower that cost. If anything, in fact, they passed legislation this year that is going to increase your costs. One example, he's back in New York. He wants the spotlight. He wants to be at the climate summit. And so he announces, I am signing, SB 253, from Scott Wiener, that requires reporting of your carbon emissions all the way through the supply chain. That policy is going to cost every consumer in California a lot of money. That is going to cause the price of everything to go up because it's expensive reporting that everybody's going to have to do all the way up the supply chain. Now they'll say, oh, it's only the big corporations. Well, the big corporations rely on vendors. They rely upon truckers. They rely upon a supply chain of people who are going to get stuck with this burden. And all it's going to mean is you pay more at the grocery store. It means that you pay more for your utility bills that are already too high. They're already too high. And so he announces this, just to give him more climate cred, but you pay the price. You pay the price in California. It's completely ridiculous. And this is the kind of things that Republicans have been talking about. We want to do things that actually lower your costs in California. We want to do things that actually have the new modern technology and innovation in our infrastructure, not building a train to nowhere, that's antiquated technology, right? But how do we improve the roads that are crumbling as we drive down them today, right? And that to me is a reasonable policy. That is getting back to a reasonable middle of focusing on what everyday Californians need and solving problems. and not trying to go to the latest shiny object just to pursue your latest political ambition.
James, that's just a lovely summary of everything that was bad in the legislative season and for the last several years, from your lips to God's ears. I'll just add this other thing is that we hear so little from you out there, and that's not on you. I'm saying that there is such a limited media offering out there, and the major media. I won't even get into the specifics, but their interests are not aligned with really getting another side to things, certainly not on climate, a range of other issues as well. But their loss is our gain, I suppose, here at Radio Free California. If you got the platform you deserved, you might not be here. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, well, and thank you, and that's a great point. And I think it is on me, and it is on Republicans, that we need to get our message out more. We need to be getting out more. It's something that I've put an emphasis on since I became leader, is we got to get outside of Sacramento, and we got to get to, and I am very thankful, for media like yourselves, these, podcasts and alternative forms of media that are popping up on, on social media and so many different spaces that's giving people information they would not get, that is really kind of vetted out by the mainstream media. And so, we certainly want to make a protracted effort to get out there and go everywhere and be talking to people in all parts of the state about these real issues. And, so we want to continue to work with you. And, like I said, we'll go to, anywhere, any place where we can talk to people about the issues they're facing and how Republicans can help be part of that solution, here in California. It's what we have to do, to really make this the land of opportunity that it once was, and has ceased to be, because of this Democratic supermajority that has existed for far too long.